ahead and get started. So welcome everybody. Thank you so much for coming out today. Hope we get to share some good information with you and get you guys outside and looking at some cool stuff out in the world around you, hopefully close to your home so you don't have to go too far. But looking for reptiles and amphibians is a cool thing that you can do with your family, with your small group of people. You don't have to get too close to people. So it's really a great pandemic activity. So just as a couple of protocol things to get us started, I'm going to ask you guys to stay muted. So down at the bottom of your screen, you should see some buttons, including one that looks like a little microphone that has a mute option on it. So you should have a little red X for your microphone. That's just to prevent all the sort of background and feedback and background noise that might be going on at your house while we're talking. And then if you go ahead and you can click on, at the bottom of your screen, there's a participants button and a chat button. And if you click on both of those to turn them on, you should see a little window pop up to your right that has a chat area and also a participants area where you can see folks who are in the meeting. And the reason I ask you to do that is just so that you can use the participants window to essentially raise your hand if you have a question. So when I'm done my presentation, if you want to ask your question, through the video, through your computer, that's great. I just ask that you raise your hand so I can call on you, and then you can unmute yourself and say your question, and then I'll respond. The other option is you can type your question into that chat window. You can either send it directly to me. There's a little option that says to everyone or to certain people. You can click that drop down and click Kate Kelly and just send me the message, the question, or you can send it to everyone. I ask that you don't use that chat window for things other than questions and answers, so no sort of private conversations behind the scenes. That makes sense. So hopefully everybody's good to go. If you guys are ready, everybody's feeling up on their Zoom protocol, maybe give me a thumbs up so I know that you're ready to go. I can't see all of you, but I see a few thumbs. All right, cool. All right, so we'll go ahead and get started. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Let me just let this last person in here. I'll get started on my presentation. This is going to be a pretty brief presentation. It's only about maybe 15-20 minutes because I didn't want to bore you guys for too long. I know everybody's busy and has other things to do. So let's start the presentation here. And then I'll take some questions after that. And just to give you fair warning, I may not be able to see your little raised hands and comments while I'm giving my presentation. So I apologize if it seems like I'm ignoring you. I'm not trying to. I will be able to see your comments after I get through the brief 15 or 20 minute presentation. Okay, so I am here to talk about spring amphibian migration today. This is part of ECHO's Take Action Citizen Science Challenge. I work for the Vermont Reptile and Amphibian Atlas, which is a group that collects data on reptiles and amphibians in Vermont and tries to use that information to make conservation decisions to, help decide what do we need to do to help these animals survive. Okay, so, sorry, I'm having a little technical difficulty here moving forward. All right, so Vermont's reptiles and amphibians. First of all, what are these things? Okay, so amphibians, you guys probably know already, are frogs and salamanders. And we have 21 species of amphibians here in Vermont. We have 10 species of salamanders and 11 of frogs. So salamander here is a little blue spotted salamander. And this is one that I'm sure you've heard, but maybe haven't seen too much, a spring peeper. Very noisy frog this time of year. We hear a lot of them in lots of choruses happening out there of spring peepers this time of year. And then there are 19 species of reptiles here in Vermont. So we have 11 species of snakes, 7 species of turtles, and 1 lizard. Here on the bottom of your screen, this was made just last week with a big snapping turtle and a northern water snake. We don't have these in all the portions of Vermont, but these are some of the species that we try to track as part of the Vermont Reptile and Amphibian Atlas. So I am a herpetologist. I study all these critters, amphibians, reptiles, and for short, just so you know, we call these guys herps, H-E-R-P-S. Sort of an easy way to say reptiles and amphibians without having to say reptiles and amphibians. Okay, so real quick, the typical frog life cycle. I bet you guys have all learned this at some point, but we'll go over it quickly. Up at the top of your screen, you have an adult frog. Okay, that frog usually spends its life partially on land or mostly on land and in the water. They return to the water to breed. So the two frogs on the right of your screen, there's a male and a female frog, and the male frog is on the back and sort of hugging the female. It's a position called amplexus, and that allows them to lay their eggs. The female lays her eggs and the male fertilizes the eggs in that position. So the eggs are down at the bottom of your screen here. Those eggs then develop into tadpoles, which grow up in the water over here on the left. They start to grow back legs, which you can just barely see here, little tiny back legs. And then their front legs pop out and they look just like little miniature frogs. They metamorphose and they come up onto land and spend years on land, depending on how old the the animal will be. It might take several years for it to be able to mature enough to get back to the water to breed. And for some species, that only takes a year or two to get sexually mature, able to breed. Okay, so now how about our salamanders? What's their life cycle? Okay, so salamanders have sort of a similar life cycle. Okay, so over here on the right side of your screen, there is your adult salamander. This is a species we don't have here in Vermont. This is a tiger salamander. These guys, again, spend most of their life on land. They go to the water and lay eggs. And then the eggs hatch out into little larval salamanders. They often have these external gills that you see here that, sort of off the sides of their heads that take oxygen out of the water. That's how they breathe. They then resorb these external gills and they come out onto land, and again, take several years to become an adult salamander and ready to breed again. Now, interestingly, we have some salamanders that do some funny stuff. So these guys, the terrestrial salamanders, they actually have a variation in their life cycle. They don't actually go to the water to lay their eggs. So these guys actually lay their eggs on land, which is what you can see here. This is an adult salamander guarding her eggs. And so she actually stays with her eggs and protects them. And then those eggs, they go through sort of their larval phase right within the egg. And when they hatch out, they look just like the adult salamanders, just really, really tiny. So they don't have those external gills like you saw in that last picture. They then just grow up on land to become these adult salamanders. All right, so why do we care? What's the deal with these amphibians? Well, first of all, they're indicators of habitat health, that they can help us sort of determine what are, how healthy the habitat is around them. They play a really important role in their ecosystems because they both eat a lot of things and they get eaten by a lot of things. So they're both prey and predator. And worldwide, about a third of our species, of our amphibian species that is, are critically endangered, or vulnerable. So they're sort of in a lot of trouble. They're in better shape here in Vermont, but worldwide, this is sort of a big problem. Herps, reptiles and amphibians, are also the vertebrate group that is the most vulnerable to road mortality, so to dying on the roads. And partially that's because they move so slowly across the roads, and because they're so small, people don't see them. And so they get run over and killed a lot on our roads. Okay, so we're here today to talk about migration, right? And we know about some animals that migrate, right? Birds, maybe some large mammals that move north or south or go into certain areas to spend the winter. And we don't always think about amphibians or reptiles, for that matter, doing migration, right? It's not like a little salamander this big moves very far. but they do still move. They have to move between where they spend the winter or their overwintering habitat and where they breed in the spring or summer, which would be a wetland, because most of these guys do lay their eggs in these wet areas. We'll talk in just a minute about where these guys lay their eggs, but generally they're fishless ponds, fishless areas. So fish will eat, amphibian eggs and larvae. So it's important for them to move to an area where there are no fish. That could be a vernal pool. It could be a swamp that has, areas around the edges that sort of act as little vernal pools, but are fishless. And it could be some other type of habitat. Where we have a road that passes between these two habitats, between where they spend the winter and where they breed, it's really easy to see this amphibian movement or migration, because these animals have to cross the road to get back and forth, and they have to do that 2 times a year, right? Spring to get to their breeding site, and fall to get, or possibly later spring to get back uphill. Okay, so how do we know where these areas are? Like, how do I find them if I go out? Well, one of the things that I use is a program called Google Earth. It's a free download, and it's super easy to explore on Google Earth. You can download the program, and then you can download topographic maps. So this is like a layer that you can turn on or off. You just click a little checkbox, and those topographic maps can help you find your own sites to investigate near you. I'm going to show you an example here of how that might work and what you can do to find those areas that might be near your house that you can go investigate. First, I wanted to show you a quick picture because I know some of you may not be familiar with what a vernal pool looks like. So this is a traditional vernal pool. It is filled here in the spring with either snow melt or rainwater or both. But it doesn't have like a stream running into it, right? You don't see something coming down here and filling up this pool. And it also doesn't have an outlet. So it's just sort of a depression in the forest that fills in the spring, and it holds water for a few months. That's like the perfect amount of time for a lot of these animals to lay their eggs and the tadpoles or the salamander larvae to develop and then get out of the pond before it dries up, hopefully. And there's no fish in there. There's no big predators that are going to eat these critters in these small vernal pools in the woods. Okay, so here's a topo map. Some of you may have seen these and may be familiar with how to read a topo map, and some may not. So I just want to give you a quick overview of sort of how this works. So here on the left side of the map, you'll see these little sort of blue squiggly lines and whatnot. This is actually a swamp. So these indicate like a wet area. Here on the right side of the map, you see the dark green, that means forested. And you'll see how these lines are very close together. That indicates that this is actually a really steep hill. So these lines are about 10 feet apart. And so the closer they are together, it means that the hill is really steep. And then up here, you'll see a lake or a pond. And it sort of levels out here. You can see the lines get a little further apart. Coming down the center of this map is a white line. That's a road. Okay, so this is one way, if I'm exploring on Google Earth, I can look at this and say, hey, look at that habitat. There's forest on both sides of the road, it's green. There's a swamp or wetland on one side, and there's this uphill habitat on the other. That looks like a good spot with a road running right down the middle. Looks like a good spot to check out and see what amphibians might be crossing from this upland habitat over here to the lowland habitat on the left of your screen to breed. Okay. You can also turn off that topographic map in Google Earth, so you can just look at the aerial view or the overhead view, and that'll help you see that this really is forested on both sides of the road, that it looks like a good spot to visit. And you can really zoom in and check out those areas. Okay, so now when do amphibians migrate? Like, when should I actually go out there to check out some of these spots near me? Usually the sort of the best time when a lot of amphibians are migrating is on rainy nights in early spring, and that usually begins about 30 minutes after dark or later. So you could go out really late at night. If you are a night owl and you like to get out at 2 in the morning and it's raining, you can go out at 2 in the morning. usually we don't see movement during the day because these guys are prey for a lot of animals and they don't want to get eaten by stuff. So they're not going to move when it's super light out. You want the roads to be nice and wet. So it should have been raining for quite a while and the roads should be still wet. Temperatures need to be above freezing and at least some of the snow needs to be melted. Amazingly, these guys can move across the surface of snow. So I've seen blue-spotted salamanders just wiggling their way over the snowpack. As long as they can get up out of the ground, they can move across the snow to get to their breeding pond. And then again, just to note, we're talking about spring amphibian migration right now, but these guys all do move back to the upland to spend the winter. So some of them move back right away after they breed, and you'll see them moving back uphill in the spring. Some of them don't move back until the fall. So you may be able to get out there in October or November and see a bunch of animals coming back out of those areas, out of the swamp. And it could be the young or it could be the adults that have spent the winter in spent the summer in some other habitat where they've been foraging. Okay, so let's get into the pretty pictures now that we're out of that boring text, right? I'll show you just a few animals that you might see out there. These are some of our more common ones and a couple of unique ones that I threw in there just to get you guys aware of some of the things that are out there that you might see. Okay, so wood frogs. These are our first amphibians to move in the spring. They're the first frog to call and breed in Vermont. They're generally just a brown-backed frog, but they have this white upper lip and a brown mask sort of around the eye here. And they make a sort of like a duck-like call, sort of like a quacking duck. You might hear them in choruses and ponds. Again, they lay their eggs pretty early, starting around March 15th and going until about June 1st. They, just like I showed in that earlier picture, the males here on top of this picture is on top of a female and he's grasping her in this amplexus position for them to lay their eggs. Down on the right side of the screen, you'll see freshly laid wood frog eggs here in somebody's hands. Okay, one of our next frogs that I'm sure you guys have heard, I'm sure most of you have heard these guys, is spring peepers, right? Peep, peep. And they are super noisy for such a little creature. They're, maybe only 1.5 inches long, but they can make a lot of noise. Their young, when they hatch out, are really, really small. So this guy down here, this is actually in centimeters. So this is a tiny, tiny critter, less than 1 centimeter long, okay, for the young. If you live in, say, the Champlain Valley or any of the larger river valleys, you might see these northern leopard frogs. They're a spotted frog, and around each spot they have sort of a light-colored halo around the edges. Those spots are pretty irregular. They're just scattered across the back. They're not in, they're not arranged nicely. On the right side, I show you the underside of this frog, and you'll see why in just a sec. But you'll notice that the underside of the frog is just white. There's no coloration underside. Now this frog, the pickerel frog, it looks pretty similar. So this frog also has spots, but their spots are arranged in nice rows. So you see these 2 rows that go down the back of spots, and they're generally more rectangular shape. They have a dark sort of border around the outside of the spot. And then if you flip this frog over, which you can see here on the underside of these frogs, I'm sorry, this picture is a little bit gory because this is a dead frog. It's a female, and you can see her eggs here that have come out of her body. She didn't quite make it to the pond. But if you look here on the underside of this frog, you see these bright yellow legs. So any pickerel frog you flip over has those bright yellow legs, both underneath the legs and usually around the waistband a little bit too. So that's a great indication. If you see a spotted frog out there and you're just not quite sure, is that a leopard frog or is that a pickerel frog? See if you can grab it, pick it up, flip it over, and see if it has those yellow legs underneath. Okay, so on to just a few of our salamanders. This is sort of our biggest terrestrial salamander. This is the spotted salamander. And these guys get up to about 8 inches long. It's a pretty big salamander. Beautiful yellow spots. And they lay these softball-sized egg masses in ponds. They're very solid. So if you were to pick them up like these guys did, it would hold together really nicely in your hand. It's a very solid egg. I wanted to show you these two pictures because there's a difference between spotted salamander egg masses and wood frog egg masses that you can actually see. So the spotted salamander egg mass here on your right is, like I said, very, very solid. And here on the left, a wood frog egg mass. You can see these little bumps around the edges of each individual egg on the wood frog egg mass. Those bumps tell you that this is a frog instead of a salamander egg. So these, again, the smooth surface on the spotted salamander egg and the bumps on the wood frog egg mass. Okay, now another unique species here in Vermont. This is a Jefferson salamander. They are fairly rare compared to spotted salamanders, but they're in the same genus or the same sort of group. So these guys are generally just sort of a brown color. You don't see those yellow spots like the spotted salamander had, and they have a vertically compressed tail, so it almost looks like a fin or something. So it looks like this if you're looking at it head on, or I'm sorry, from overhead. Their egg masses are a little bit different. There are fewer eggs in the mass, and it's really like jelly-like. You can see how it's sort of hanging down here. Not as solid as those spotted salamander egg masses. Okay, now one of its relatives, the blue spotted salamander, this guy is beautiful. Not quite as big, so the adults for a pure blue spotted salamander only get up to about 4 inches long. But they have these beautiful blue flecks all down the sides of the body. Now, one of our terrestrial salamanders, this is one of the ones I was telling you about that actually doesn't migrate to the ponds to lay their eggs. They actually lay their eggs on land. This is the eastern red-backed salamander. You can see they have this red stripe down the back. And when we see these guys out moving on the roads at night, it's often because they're leaving their upland habitat where they overwintered to move to a better spot for the summer. It's not because they're going to the pond to lay eggs. It's just because maybe their overwintering habitat wasn't as good as, you know, some other habitat where they're going to spend the summer. But we do see these guys out and about moving, moving along with some of the other critters. All right, now what do you think about this guy? Looks pretty similar, right? This is the four-toed salamander. Looks really similar to the redback salamander. But if you were to flip this guy over, you'd see this beautiful white belly with black spots. Again, I'll go back one slide just so you can see, whoops, I think I will go back. So you can see the belly of the eastern redback salamander. This is sort of a like worm-like pattern. Doesn't have that beautiful white belly with black spots. Okay, so the four-toed salamander, he actually does breed in the wetlands, so in the swamps under moss. Cool thing about these guys, the mothers actually stay and guard the eggs. So they'll stay with their eggs until they hatch and drop down into the water, and then the larvae spend their larval phase in the water to develop until they come back out on land. And in the fall, you'll see these really tiny little baby four-toed salamanders, which are here on the left side of your screen, moving back uphill like in October and November. Now, one that I bet a lot of you guys have seen out there, the eastern newt. This is a red eft, so this is a juvenile phase of the eastern newt. They're a little bit different too in that they lay their eggs in the water. Okay, so the adults are in the water, they lay their eggs. The larvae grow up in the water just like the rest of our salamanders. And then they reach this juvenile phase where they come out on land. And these little guys, they have this bright orange color. They walk around on land for up to about 8 years. That's a long time. It's as old as some of you guys are. I see some in the audience who are probably 8 years old, right? And so they might walk around on land for 8 years, and then they turn into an adult and they change color and they return to the pond. And the adults actually swim around in the pond and they spend their adult life fully aquatic in the pond, which is a little bit different than most of our adult salamanders that spend their lives on land. Okay, so real quick, we'll go over just a couple of methods and like ways that you guys can contribute to the Vermont Herp Atlas. So the Vermont Herp Atlas, or Vermont Reptile and Amphibian Atlas, mission is to gather and disseminate data that are needed to make informed recommendations regarding state status, state rank, and conservation of Vermont's reptiles and amphibians. So one of the things that we do is we create these maps that you see here on the bottom of your screen. This is a map of spring peeper distribution in Vermont, so where we have records of spring peepers. So we take records from people like you who send us photos, and we map them, and we try to figure out, okay, how many towns of Vermont have spring peepers? Where are they found? And the reason for this is that if we don't know where they are to begin with, we can't protect them, right? We don't know if they're declining or in good shape or not. So spring peepers are found, as you can see, pretty much throughout the state of Vermont, with a few exceptions. But if you were to look at this map, there are some spots here. See this little gray spot up in the light gray up in the northern part of the state? I'm not quite sure which town that is, but that town has never had a report of a spring peeper in it. So one of the things that you could do if you happen to live nearby there is you could go to that town and you could drive the roads on a spring night and stop and get out and walk and snap a photo of a spring peeper. Send it to us at the Vermont Herp Atlas, and you'll fill in that little dot on our map and help us figure out what's where in the state of Vermont. Okay, so that's what I just mentioned. This is part of ECHO's Take Action Citizen Science Challenge. You can find a town near you that's missing this documentation and send us photos. There are other programs in the state that also collect data. So iNaturalist is an interesting one. You can snap photos with your phone or with your parents' phone, and somebody will identify the photo for you, which is pretty cool. So if you don't know what it is, you can get your data in that way. The Vermont Reptile and Amphibian Atlas receives some of that information automatically, so we get the reports of the more rare species. So we'll add that to our database. But honestly, it's best if you can report to both places, because some of that information otherwise does not get to us. You can also check out North Branch Nature Center's Citizen Science. They do some interesting, more involved surveys of like specific sections of roads if you wanted to get involved with a specific road crossing near you. Again, check out ECHO's Citizen Science Challenge on Facebook. They're going to be doing different things every week. If you know of an area where there's a really big amphibian crossing, maybe choose a different route to go home on those rainy nights when you suspect there might be a lot of amphibians crossing. And also get out and help amphibians across the road in the direction they're heading. So even if it doesn't make sense to you, even if it seems like a spotted salamander should be going downhill or uphill, if it's going downhill, send it downhill. So just pick it up, gently move it across the road in the way it's going. All right, so what do you need to do this, to get out there at night, these rainy nights, early spring? First of all, be safe, okay? So if you have a reflective vest, you wanna put that on. If you don't have a reflective vest, wear some light colored clothes. You don't wanna be out there in your all black clothes at night and risk a car hitting you. Bring a bright flashlight. We always recommend you bring extra batteries too, in case your batteries die on you. You might even bring 2 flashlights just to have a backup. It really helps to have a super bright light out there to help you see some of these really tiny critters that otherwise, they're only 4 inches long and they're really, really tiny. So if you have a really bright light, that helps a lot. A raincoat, because it could be raining out there. It could rain anytime. Something to write on and with. You're going to want to make notes about what you're seeing. A camera, so you can take pictures and send it in to us. A partner in your family. You don't have to have a partner, but it's more fun with somebody out there. And again, you're going to drive the roads. If you don't have a target area in mind, like if you haven't looked at the maps beforehand, you can just go drive around certain roads. If you look for these frogs and larger salamanders, like the spotted salamanders I mentioned, those big 8-inch ones, you'll actually see those crossing the road. So if you see large, spotted salamanders crossing the road or a bunch of frogs in an area, we recommend that you stop, you get out of your car, and then you walk that stretch of road. And the reason for that, again, is because these little tiny guys, like the 4-toed salamanders, you're not going to see with your naked eye if you're driving, at 15 miles an hour down the road, even if you're going slow. All right, so I'll briefly go through the Herp Atlas website here just to give you guys a little bit of knowledge so you know how to report to us. The website is vtherpatlas.org. And when you get there, this is the homepage that you'll see. Up here in the right corner where I've circled in red, you'll see tell us about it. If you go ahead and click there, you'll get to this page where you can submit a sighting to us. If you know what species you're looking at, you can type it in here. If you don't know, that's okay too. You can just write salamander ? And attach your photo. And we will actually get back to you. This comes directly to Jim Andrews' email, and he will reply to you and say, thank you for your record of, and he'll tell you what it was in case you didn't know. You're going to fill in how many of them you saw. And then if you didn't have a photo of it, but you didn't really know what it was, you're going to want to describe it pretty well. So like what color it was, what markings it had, any other info you think might be helpful. The next part of this is like when you saw it, where you saw it. So you're going to want to describe, you know, what road you were on, what you were near, what town you were in. And then in this section that says any other info or notes, you may want to include things like how many cars went past you, how many of the animals were dead and how many were alive, and which way they were moving. Were they moving downhill to the breeding area, or were they moving uphill back towards the overwintering habitat? And then of course you'll fill in your contact information, your email and your name. Now this is great. You can get out and do this near your house, you know, some crossing area near you. One of the things that we are really looking for data on is things that are common, that we think are out there, but we don't have records of them in certain towns. So we have this nice table that you can search. Down here at the bottom, you'll see this empty search box. This is under priorities and data gaps. And then in the data gaps section, you can search for your town here, or you can search for a certain species. And then you can sort the table to see, you know, what's near you and what gaps you might be able to fill in. We also have some species that we say are quote unquote always report. These things are rare or unusual. And if you see any of these creatures out there, we want you to report them to us. So it doesn't matter if, you know, they're, if they've been reported from that town before, for example, we'd still like to know about where you saw them. So this includes Jefferson salamander, blue spotted salamander, four-toed salamander, and then some others, mud puppy, Fowler's toad, mink frog, and boreal chorus frog. Okay, so that is the end of my presentation. I'm sorry I went way longer than what I thought I was going to go. It's hard to keep it to 20 minutes. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and then I'm going to be able to see all of your comments, hopefully. And I will start to ask some, to answer some questions, I hope. So let's see, somebody asked if the presentation is shareable. I think I can probably do that. I am recording right now to the cloud, so I'll try to figure out how to get the presentation shareable to everybody. And let's see, question. Okay, question. Can some amphibians climb trees? Yes, that's a great question, Wallace. Some amphibians can climb trees. We have gray tree frogs that are actually, you know, really good tree climbers. They have these big sticky toe pads on the ends of their toes, so they can just climb right up anything. They can climb up your window or a tree. Some other salamanders are actually good climbers too. I've seen salamanders up on plants and on tree stumps out at night. They often get up there to try to forage for insects, to try to find food. So we do have some good climbers around. Let's see. I'm just scrolling here quickly to try to see if there's some other good questions. Oh, here's a good question. Is it safe to help a snapper get across the road? So this is not totally related, but related to you know, moving reptiles and amphibians across the road. So yes, it is safe to move snappers across the road if you're careful about it. My preferred method is to get behind the snapping turtle and grab its back legs. So you kind of go in from behind, grab the two back legs and lift it up that way. Some people will say you can grab it by the tail, but for a big snapper that can actually hurt their spines. So we don't recommend you grabbing it by the tail. Some people like to use like a floor, like a car mat, the floor mat out of a car to kind of like get the snapper, part of the snapper on the mat and then kind of pull it across with that. But again, remember that the snapping turtle's neck is probably about as long as its shell. So it can reach pretty far back. You don't want to have your hands anywhere in sort of the front, like half of the snapping turtle's area, because it could reach its neck back around. Let's see, another good question. Somebody asked about, do we need to do anything special with our hands to help them cross? Like, should we be wearing gloves? What do we need to worry about? So we always say you want to make sure you don't have anything like artificial on your hands. You don't want bug spray on your hands, sunscreen, you know, any of that sort of stuff. You might want to get your hands a little bit damp, a little wet, but generally, like, I wouldn't worry too much about, you know, touching these animals to help them across the road. If you see like an animal that has might have a disease, like it looks sick or something, I would generally not, you know, you wouldn't want to touch that animal and then touch some other animal and potentially spread a disease. But generally I would say it's not a problem. You just want to, you know, be careful. And let's see. Oh, somebody wants to know what eats them. So what eats all these critters? Probably about anything will eat amphibians. Some of these little salamanders are so tiny, they're just an easy snack for any number of like bird species, say, that live in the woods that might find them under, you know, under cover. Small mammals, you know, also love to eat these critters. So really anything, they're like a really good snack for anything that that is hungry out there. Birds, you know, turtles, even frogs. Large frogs might eat smaller animals. So lots of things eat these guys. Okay, so I think I've gotten through most of the text comments. So now, does anybody have questions that they want to ask in person, like on video? And if you do, you can hit your little raise hand button down at the bottom under participants. And hopefully I'm going to see it pop up. Oh, okay. All right, Maureen, go ahead with your question.
Do you also want reports of eggs? Like, I live really close to vernal pools, and I believe it's all wood frog, the ones I can see easily. Like, is that something you want to be reported?
Yeah, absolutely. Eggs work. Yeah, eggs work just as well as the adults, as long as we can, you know, it's a decent picture of the egg mass that we can identify it. So go for it. We'd love to hear where the pools are too, especially if they're like vernal pools that we can map. You know, if you can give us like a point, here's where it was on the map, that's great for our purposes too.
And the future, so I'm excited to like have the kids do this. And I was looking, even just now you were talking, there's some good things that kids can go out and look for on your list.
Oh, good. That's so cool. Great, thank you. Let's see. Is that Izzy and Benji I see with your hand up? Did you guys have a question? If you can unmute.
Yeah, can you talk about snakes? Because we haven't heard a lot about snakes.
It's true. We haven't heard a lot about snakes in this presentation. Is there anything in particular you want to know?
Like, do some or not? Do some poisonous snakes live here?
So we have one, what's called a venomous species of snake in Vermont, which is the timber rattlesnake. Just so you guys know, we'll do a little education on venomous and poisonous. So poisonous is something that if you eat it, it makes you sick. Okay. Venomous is if it injects something into you, like a snake might through its bite, or through like a wasp or something that stings you. That's a venom. So they inject it into your body and that makes you sick. So we have venomous snakes here in Vermont, not poisonous, because you don't eat those snakes, right? I hope not. So the one venomous species we have is a timber rattlesnake. It's only found in one county in Vermont. So it's pretty unusual. There used to be a lot more timber rattlesnakes in Vermont, and we have historic like newspaper records from people who had snakes in various parts of Vermont, but they're not there anymore, probably because people killed them, unfortunately. So hundreds of years ago, people were killing rattlesnakes. So now we're down to just, you know, one little area where we have those rattlesnakes. Okay. All right, it looks like Natalia, sorry. You can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Go ahead, Kate.
I was wondering
Say your name.
I'm Gabriel, and I was wondering what time of year and season do the vernal pools dry up?
That's a really good question. So it depends a little bit on the year and the weather. Usually, I guess I would say like August time frame. But again, like if we have a really dry year, the pools might dry up faster. And that might be a really bad year for the amphibians. Like they might not be able to get their young might not develop in time enough to get out of the pools before it dries. So we have a variety of years depending on the weather. Good question.
Thank you.
Yeah. Looks like Emma maybe has a question. Go ahead, Emma.
I was wondering, where are the rattlesnakes in Vermont?
So they're only in western Rutland County. If you know where Rutland County is, sort of near Rutland. And you know, generally they're not anything you need to worry about. They're not going to be like out and about generally in people's houses or yards or anything like that. But unless you're in that one really specific area of Vermont, you wouldn't really see them or be concerned about them. Okay, other questions? Okay. Well, I'm not seeing any other hands up. So I guess with that, we'll conclude. I appreciate you guys all coming out today. This was really fun, and hope I answered some of your questions, and I hope you guys get out there and get us some good data.